A young boy named Alk was busy fishing by the lake one day when a strange man suddenly approached him and asked if he'd like to learn some magic. The offer sounded way too good to pass up, so from then on, Alk would spend the entire day training with Eldis to become a mage. One particular day, Eldis was giving Alk a lesson on how to use fire magic in case he ever needed to protect others, and it was a little more complicated than what Alk was used to, but he eventually got the hang of it. He was a little disappointed that it took him a whole day to master fire magic, but Eldis reminds him that most people have to study for an entire month to accomplish what he just did in a single day, so he should be proud of himself. Alk still wants to learn more, so he asks Eldis to continue teaching him. But he says they've done enough for today, so instead he suggests that they should just do some fishing until it's time for Alk to go home. Alk ends up agreeing to take a break, but he's not happy about it because he wants to learn magic as quickly as possible. Eldis chuckles and tells Alk that he has incredible talent for magics, so even if Eldis hadn't started training him, he's sure Alk would have become an exceptional mage on his own. If that's the case, then Alk asks why Eldis even bothered teaching him in the first place, and Eldis has his reasons, but before he could explain anything, a fish took the bait and started pulling on his line, so both he and Alk immediately dropped the conversation and tried to pull it up with all their might. The next day, Alk's training continues, and this time, Eldis has brought a magic book for him to read, but to Alk, it's more confusing than the time they started adding letters to math, so it takes a while for him to understand. Over the next few months, Eldis takes his time explaining all the magical formulas to him, and little by little he comes to understand them. However, by spring the next year, when it was time for their usual training session, Eldis came bearing some bad news. He said he has to leave the capital soon, so he won't be able to train Alk anymore, but before he leaves, he wants to give his student a friendly warning. With his talent, Alk could easily become a court magician if he wanted to, but Eldis told him that if anyone ever offered him the job, he should turn it down immediately, because it's not worth the trouble. He then turns to walk away, but before he leaves, Alk has one final question for him. So he asks why Eldis chose to teach him magic in the first place, and Eldis explains that he did it because Alk's mother did him a huge favor while she was still alive, so he wanted to repay that kindness by looking after her son. Several years later, Alk is now a student at the Royal Academy, and he has just found one of the school's old yearbooks, so he flips through it and finds the section about Eldis. Just as expected, Eldis was the top graduating student at the time, and he became a court magician shortly after, but for some reason he ended up getting banished from the kingdom, which is probably why he was forced to leave Alk back then. In that moment, Alk decides that the best thing he can do is become a court magician to change the opinion of the imperial court so he can repay Eldis' kindness, completely forgetting that that's exactly what Eldis told him not to do, and fast forward a little, we see Alk getting banished just like Eldis was. Alk had joined the hero party consisting of the crown prince, Regulus, a mage named Leni, and a knight named Ix, but while they were in the middle of a mission, Regulus tells him he's fired. Alk doesn't understand why Regulus would suddenly want to get rid of him like this, so he explains that as the crown prince, his job is to be on the front lines with his sword, Leni is meant to push enemies back with her magic, and Ix blocks enemy attacks for the party. But all Alk ever does is stay in the back and cast support spells like defense or enhancement. Alk tries to argue that there's an important reason he does that, but Regulus cuts him off and says someone who can only use support magic is too pathetic to be a member of the hero party. Keep in mind that Alk never even wanted to join this stupid party in the first place, but after he became a court magician, the prince ordered him to join, and he couldn't refuse a royal command. Leni and Ix join in and start calling Alk useless, but the prince is the one who's really useless here. He literally made a rule that commoners like Alk aren't allowed to carry weapons, just because he doesn't want anyone else to steal his spotlight. Alk tries explaining to him that he thinks it's important for all party members to be armed and prepared in case of emergencies, but the prince hasn't had an intelligent thought for years at this point, so he will not tolerate a free thinker like Alk. He tells him that he isn't needed anymore, so he should just go home, and Alk is left questioning his life choices because he did not sign up to be insulted by an ungrateful man-child. Up to this point, Alk had put in an insane amount of effort to compensate for Regulus' stupidity, because he would have died a long time ago otherwise, but even after he was fired, he still wanted to help as much as possible. So he wrote out some monster attack patterns and strategies for Regulus to use next time he goes into the dungeon. However, while he was on his way to deliver the letter at the castle, he was suddenly stopped at the gates by the guards. They informed him that he had been stripped of his title as a court mage, so he no longer has permission to enter the castle. Just then, Leni shows up and she's just here to rub Alk's unfortunate situation in his face because she has always hated him. He was praised to no end when he graduated from the Magic Academy and set a new dungeon record, so she's been jealous of him since day one. After she's done mocking him, she turns around to leave, but Alk begs her to at least deliver this letter to the king for him. It was King Furcus who ordered him to join Regulus' party, so for Regulus' sake, it's important that the king reads this letter. However, Leni couldn't care less about Alk's stupid letter, so she rips it to shreds right in front of him and orders the guards to kick him out. It has been 4 years since Alk graduated and became a court magician, and he tried his absolute best to fix the problems with the imperial court, but in the end, he couldn't change anything. Just then, Alk hears a familiar voice call out his name, so he turns around and finds Yorha, an old friend of his, standing there. She runs over for a hug once she realizes it really is him, and afterwards, they sit down by the canal to talk. Alk explains everything that happened to him since the last time he saw Yorha, and she yells that she can't stand the kingdom of Galdina because the nobles are always so focused on discriminating against the commoners. Alk agrees with her, but he tells her to quiet down because it'd be troublesome if someone were to overhear her rant. She tells him it's fine since no one else is around right now, and regarding Alk's current situation, she feels bad for everything he had to go through, but she's actually glad that he got kicked out of the prince's party, because that means there's nothing stopping him from joining a new party now. And on that note, Yorha asks Alk if he'd be willing to come clear dungeons with her party. Alk asks her if she's really okay with recruiting someone like him, but she knows better than anyone that Alk is a beast when it comes to magic, so there's no one else as qualified as he is. Hearing someone finally acknowledge his strength brings a tear to Alk's eye, so he gets up and tells Yorha that he'd love to join her party. The next morning, the two begin their journey to the city of Faisal, and Alk has flashbacks to what elders told him about avoiding the imperial court, and how things would have been so much easier for him if he had just listened to his advice, but it's not like he can change the way things played out now. Meanwhile, back in the capital, Regulus has just been informed that Alk left the capital and calls him a sorry excuse for a mage. He'd only ever forced Alk to join his party because everyone called him a magical prodigy, but he hated having a commoner on the team, so he's glad he got rid of him. Lainey adds that now they can get a replacement who is of pure noble blood, and without an incompetent fool like Alk slowing them down, Regulus will become famous for clearing a dungeon faster than anyone else. A few days later, Alk and Yorha arrive in the city of Faisal, and she begins telling him all about how wonderful this place is because it doesn't discriminate against commoners, and it's the perfect base for an adventuring party. Speaking of which, that reminds Yorha that they still need to get Alk registered as an adventurer, so she leads him to the guild so he can get started. Unfortunately, when they get inside, the receptionist tells Alk that he doesn't qualify. You need a special license to go past level 30 in a dungeon, and you need to be registered with the guild for at least 2 years to qualify for that license, so Alk won't be able to get it for a while. Yorha asks if they can make an exception for him, but the receptionist says she can't change the rules. Yorha can't believe this is happening, even though she sent her friend Keisha to come ask for special permission before they got here. But it turns out that Keisha was incredibly rude to the receptionist, so they won't be getting any favors from her anytime soon. Yorha is really disappointed since her party has already reached the 52nd floor of the dungeon, and they won't be able to make any new progress with Alk until he gets his license in 2 years. She realizes that there's no point in complaining about it now, so she says they should just focus on the places Alk is allowed to go in the meantime. He doesn't need the pass to go into areas above level 30, so there's still plenty of exploring for them to do as a group, and she wants him to enjoy his time here. Later that day, Alk and Yorha head into one of the dungeons and are currently facing a swarm of red hornets. Yorha casts enhancement magic on him so he can take down a few of the hornets, but that barely leaves a dent in their numbers. She doesn't understand why things got so difficult so quickly, since level 2 was never this hard to clear before, but Alk thinks something must have happened to the hornet nest, which is why all of them are in a frenzied state right now. Yorha puts up a defensive shield and charges into the swarm, but Alk warns her to stay back because it'd be much safer to maintain their position and take the hornets out one by one. Yorha yells that he needs to remember what he was like before he became a court magician. Back then, a swarm of hornets like this would have been no match for him, and he now realizes he doesn't have to hold back to avoid bruising the prince's ego anymore, so he is free to use as much magic as he needs. He stops restraining himself and uses attack magic to burn up a few of the hornets, and once he regroups with Yorha, he uses a wide area thunderbolt spell to fry the remaining bugs. However, just when it seemed like the battle was over, a giant earthworm emerges from the ground and grabs Yorha. This thing must have been the reason the hornets were acting so crazy earlier, and it's definitely going to eat Yorha if he doesn't do something soon, so he needs to act quickly. He has a plan in mind, but just to make sure it will work, he asks her if her defense magic is still as strong as it was back when they were in the academy, and in response she asks him if his attack magic is still as strong as she remembers it to be. They both trust each other's capabilities, so Alk begins casting his fire tornado spell, completely engulfing the worm in a torrent of flames. Yorha was caught up in the flames as well, but Alk knows her shields are more than enough to protect her from flames of this intensity, so there's no need for him to worry. Once Yorha is back on the ground, she tells Alk that his magic is still just as amazing as before, and she can't wait to meet up with the rest of the team so they can have fun just like old times. Before graduation, Alk was part of a legendary team of students consisting of Ornis the Genius Warrior, Krasia the Genius Archer, Yorha the Genius Support Mage, and Alk the Genius Attack Mage. On the day of graduation, they had just broken the all-time dungeon record by clearing the 68th floor, and as a result, they earned themselves top ranks at the academy. But as they were walking home and discussing their plans for the future, Alk suddenly stopped in his tracks and told his friends that he actually planned to become a court magician. His friends are disappointed to hear that, especially Ornis, since if Alk had joined them, they could have created the strongest adventuring party in existence, but he respects Alk's decision because he knows he must have a good reason. But before they went their separate ways, Yorha made it clear to Alk that she isn't giving up on recruiting him, so the second he becomes available, she will be there to extend an offer. That brings us back to the present, where Yorha is officially welcoming Alk to the party, and to celebrate, she treats him to a hearty dinner. However, she doesn't do so well with alcohol, so after one mug of beer, she becomes belligerent and can barely stay standing. It doesn't take long before she collapses on her seat and falls asleep, so Alk uses magic to cover her with his jacket so she won't catch a cold. Just then, a man suddenly appears behind him and says Alk is awfully considerate for an adventurer. Alk thinks it's just a random drunkard, so he decides to ignore the man and turns away, but this gets on the man's nerves, so he swings his bottle at Alk. The glass shatters on impact, but Alk had used a magic shield to protect himself, and he is about to retaliate, but all of a sudden, the man calls him by his name and tells him he lives up to the rumors. He then slides a dungeon pass onto the table for Alk and tells him he can think of it as an apology for testing him in such a crude manner. Alk was angry before, but now he's just confused because he has no idea who this man is, but all of a sudden, Yorha gets up from a drunken daze and asks Alk what the Guildmaster is doing here. Alk is shocked to find out that this man is really the Guildmaster, and the Guildmaster says he'd like to see what the former court magician can do in person, so he asks Alk to come down to the training center with him. A little while later, they all arrive at the assessment room, and the Guildmaster officially introduces himself as Leviel Stands. Alk recalls hearing stories of how Leviel used to be part of an S-rank party, so he knows fighting him won't be an easy task, but he is still excited because he thinks this is the perfect chance to polish his skills before actually heading into a dungeon. As soon as the match begins, Alk launches a Thunderbolt at Leviel, but he rolls out of the way and launches a Water Slash at Alk in retaliation. Alk realizes that he won't be able to rely on long-range spells here, so he decides to get in close and beat Leviel in hand-to-hand combat. However, as he was approaching, Leviel had cast enhancement magic on his body, giving himself an insane speed and power boost. He is now so fast that Alk can barely keep track of his movements, and when Leviel finally decides to strike, even though Alk was able to block the strike with his shield, he is still sent flying into one of the walls. Yorha is starting to get worried, but Alk soon gets up and says he's fine. He was caught off guard by the speed of Leviel's attack earlier, so he starts thinking of ways he can dodge it next time. But then he starts laughing because he realizes he can actually do a lot more than dodge. Under the prince's command, Alk was forbidden from being proactive in combat, but as an adventurer, he isn't limited to evasion and support magic anymore. He coats his wand in magic to create a sword and charges forward, so Leviel launches another water splash at him. But Alk is easily able to slash through it as he advances. Leviel is impressed, but he doesn't think Alk will be able to do the same to his punches, so he enhances himself against and charges at him again. However, Alk had already prepared a countermeasure for Leviel's dash attack, so as soon as he gets within range, he is hit with the full force of Alk's Thunderbolt spell, leaving him wide open for Alk to strike. Leviel is amazed that Alk actually managed to land a hit on him, and he can see why Yorha praises him so often, but this test is far from over. Leviel activates his ancient artifact, forming large gauntlets around his arms, and a single punch from these babies is enough to leave a massive crater in the ground. Alk realizes getting hit by one of those would be devastating, so he needs to be really careful, but he doesn't intend to give up, so he tries hitting him with another Thunderbolt, but this time, it barely does anything to slow him down. Leviel's artifact's special ability allows him to heal his injuries over time, so the longer this battle drags out, the worse Alk's odds of victory will become. He needs to keep Leviel from healing, so he begins striking at him repeatedly, but none of his attacks are landing. Alk mocks Leviel for dodging all his attacks and asks him if he's scared to face him head-on, and that gets under Leviel's skin, so he takes a wild swing at Alk, leaving himself wide open for a slash to the stomach just as Alk had hoped. He has finally done some more damage to Leviel, but it's going to take a lot more than that to keep him down. Leviel charges at Alk again, and Alk tries to defend himself with his shield, but it shatters on impact from the sheer force of the punch. However, it does break Leviel's momentum, so Alk uses the opportunity to strike him in the chest. Leviel refuses to let himself loose to Alk, so he tries to hammer fist him, creating a massive dust cloud. Yorha thinks Leviel is going a little too far for something that's meant to be a test. A hit like that should have been enough to knock Alk out, but he still manages to sneak up behind Leviel and launch one final strike, and that was the last of the strength he could muster, so his wand snaps and he falls unconscious. Yorha rushes to Alk's side to check on him, and Leviel admits he might have taken things a bit too far this time, declaring Alk the true victor of the match. While Yorha tends to Alk's injuries, Ornus shows up, having grown tired waiting for him, only to be shocked to discover that Alk had been dueling with Leviel. He tells Leviel that it was pretty lame of him to use his ultimate weapon in a friendly sparring match, but Leviel says he just got a little carried away. He is now sure without a doubt that Alk is qualified to enter the dungeon, so he can have the dungeon pass and whatever else he needs as long as he promises not to sue over this. Even though it didn't go as expected, Ornus congratulates Alk on passing this unfair test, but he's still out cold, so they take him back inside and set him down on a couch to rest. By now, they've all heard the story of the injustice Alk had to endure as a court mage, and it's honestly amazing that he managed to last there so long. The castle is full of elitist idiots who can't stand the sight of commoners, so Alk must have had to work incredibly hard to maintain his position. Just then, the receptionist barges in looking for the Guildmaster and tells him that there's bad news, so Leviel tells the others he has some business to handle and leaves them in his office to look after Alk. But he demands that they absolutely do not touch his alcohol collection. As soon as Leviel is gone, Ornus immediately heads over to his alcohol collection and grabs the most expensive-looking bottle just to piss Leviel off later. He then asks Yorha to fill him in on the exact details of Alk's time as a court mage, since he has only heard vague stories up till now. And oh boy, there's a lot to talk about. Alk was tasked with protecting the prince, but he was also forbidden from carrying a sword or using any magic that would make him look stronger than the prince. On top of that, he was also forced to carry their luggage and manage the party's items. And worst of all, after forcing Alk to use nothing but support magic, the prince called him useless for using only support magic. Ornis is a little confused by that last part because he thought Alk's specialty was attack magic, so Yorn explains that Alk went out of his way to learn support magic to appease the prince, even though he wasn't suited for it. After learning of everything that the prince put Alk through, Ornis is enraged beyond belief, and as soon as Alk wakes up, he suggests they should put the dungeon raid on hold and head over to the kingdom to beat up that damn prince who made Alk suffer so much. Alk tells Ornis to calm down because while he is upset about the way he was treated, he isn't angry enough to go maim the prince. However, Ornis is more than willing to do it on Alk's behalf if he wants. Alk puts his arm on Ornis' shoulder and tells him that he really doesn't have to worry about it, because as long as he gets to go on adventures with his friends, he doesn't care about anything else. Besides, he's sure karma's going to hit the prince hard now that no one's there to clean up his messes anymore. Hearing that gives Ornis a great idea, so he tells Alk they just need to become the world's greatest adventurers, and eventually, once news reaches the castle, the prince will definitely regret kicking Alk out. And when he starts begging for Alk to come back, he will have the opportunity to look him right in the eyes and reject him with as many insults as he feels like. Alk admits that he likes the sound of that, so he fist bumps Ornis, promising that they'll become the strongest party together. Meanwhile, in the other room, a member of an S-rank party is being bandaged up while she gives the guild master a breakdown of everything that happened on her mission. It was a complete failure, and the rest of her teammates are still stuck in the dungeon, so Krista asks Leviel to assemble a rescue team for them. Leviel calls an all-hands-on-deck meeting, but considering the short notice, the only people available right now are the ones who are already at the guild. He tells everyone that they will be forming a team to rescue the members of Krista's party, who are currently stuck on level 64 of the dungeon. All the adventurers exchange worried looks because they all know how dangerous that floor is, but while the meeting is going on, Alk is still sitting in the guild master's office by himself. Once Krejja arrives, she finds Alk all alone and asks him how he has been doing, but judging by all the injuries he currently has, he obviously isn't doing great. She asks him what he's doing here when they have a meeting to attend, but Alk says he didn't want to intrude since everyone at the meeting is an A-rank adventurer, and he still thinks of himself as an outsider compared to them. Krejja raises her hand and uses restoration magic to heal Alk, and after that, she tells him that he should know no one here would call him an outsider. While Alk was a court magician, he had subconsciously developed the trait of never standing out or speaking up because he risked offending the pretentious nobles. And even though he knows things are different here, it's not easy to break 4 years' worth of habits overnight. Krejja can tell that Alk is having a rough time, so she pats him on the head and says she's always here if he needs help, and that makes him feel a lot better. A few moments later, Ornis and Yora return, and Ornis tells Alk that they just got the perfect excuse to head into the dungeon. He explains the details to Alk and tells him that the place they'll be heading is called the Tank Killer. It was given that nickname because while inside, all forms of healing magic are completely useless, so you can only rely on potions for recovery. Alk is surprised that Krejja is okay with this mission since healing magic is one of her specialties, but she actually does hate the idea of going there. She just got forced into accepting it because Ornis kept insisting that it'd be a good starter mission for the team. Alk is a little worried that he may not be strong enough to be of any help, but Yora tells him he is the backbone of the operation. Their entire operation will be relying on Alk's magic, so they literally wouldn't be able to do it without him. The goal is to reach the party stuck on floor 64, and if they had to go down the normal way, they would never make it in time, but fortunately, they have this. The guildmaster gave them a dungeon core, an item that allows you to skip boss battles up until the floor it was found on. This is the one that Krista brought back with her, so they should be able to use it to clear a path to the 64th floor fairly easily, but they do still need to be careful. The floor boss for level 64 is said to be an undead monster, so they will be relying on Alk's attack magic to take it out. To that end, they all tell Alk to conserve his energy as much as possible until they face off against the undead boss, but he asks if it's really okay for him to sit out most of the fighting, and Ornis tells him that this is the best way to do it since they can't risk Alk running out of energy during the big fight. The group teleports down to the 64th floor, and as soon as they arrive, they are confronted by a group of skeletons, so Ornis rushes ahead and begins taking them out with his spear. Yora tells Ornis to wait up because she needs to be nearby to cast defense magic on him, but with how things are going, he probably doesn't need it. Alk and Krejja slowly walk through the dungeon, and he mentions how surprised he was to find out that Ornis owns an artifact just like Leviel. Krejja explains that it's pretty much just a spear with sharpness and unbreaking 3 enchanted on it, but that's all someone like Ornis really needs. It's starting to get boring down here since Ornis is handling everything on his own, so Alk asks him if he needs a little help, but Ornis shuts him down and says he's got to take care of all the fodder on his own. Alk and Krejja keep walking, but all of a sudden he senses something trying to creep up on him, so Alk instinctively turns around and fires a lightning bolt at it. The others stop what they were doing and ask Alk what's wrong, so he explains that he felt like there was something behind him just now, and Ornis trusts his judgment. So he asks Alk if he can figure out what and where the thing is. Alk still can't see whatever it is, but his senses are saying it's right in front of him, so he creates a mana sword and strikes. His sword connects with its body, revealing the creature to be a Grim Reaper, and Ornus cheers for Alk because it looks like his senses are still as sharp as ever. The way Ornus said that makes Alk think he must have known about the Grim Reaper ahead of time, but in Ornus' defense, while he did know there were invisible monsters on this level, he didn't know how to deal with them, so he thought it would be a good idea to let Alk figure it out on his own to boost his confidence a little. Recognition and trust are two things that Alk never received while he worked as a court mage, so it makes him happy to know that his teammates have so much faith in him. But as he takes out the Grim Reaper, he yells that it still doesn't make what Ornus did right. Krejza and Yora also knew about the invisible enemies and didn't tell Alk about it, and they apologized for it, but it was all Ornus' idea in the first place, so Krejza tells Alk to take his anger out on him instead. Alk tells Ornus that they are going to have a long talk about this once they get home, but first, they need to complete their mission, so the party presses deeper into the dungeon. Further down the line, they end up running into a horde of skeletons that's even bigger than before, and Ornus gets excited because this is bound to be a decent challenge. Yora reminds him that they are here on rescue mission, so there's no need to overdo it, but there's nothing Ornus loves more than a good fight. He tells everyone to stand back so he can handle this by himself, but Alk refuses to let him go ahead on his own again, so he joins in on the fight while Yora casts enhancement magic on them. However, while they are both easily able to take out the skeletons they are facing, they forgot that Yora sucks at fighting and left her completely defenseless. Luckily, Krejza was there to save her, but Alk doesn't want to take another risk like that, so he tells everyone to get behind him so he can finish this. They all do as he says, and Alk begins casting a wide area Thunderbolt spell. Now that the coast is cleared, they can continue progressing through the dungeon, but before they move on, Ornus has a question for Alk. Sure, it has worked out well so far, but he is starting to wonder why Alk keeps spamming the Lightning Bolt spell so much. Back when they were in school together, Alk used to use all kinds of cool spells to fight, so he wants to know what brought on the change. Alk thinks back to all the times the prince recklessly charged into the dungeon without thinking, leaving Alk to clean up his messes, and at some point, Alk must have defaulted to using Lightning Bolt since it had the quickest activation time. Just then, they all hear a terrifying sound coming from deeper in the dungeon, and Yora is certain that it must be the floor boss. They need to get over there as soon as possible, so they all agree to let Ornus run ahead since he is the fastest among them all. Yora casts a speed boost on everyone here, and Ornus takes off running, so the rest follow from behind. No matter how many times Alk sees it, he's always impressed by just how fast Ornus really is, especially with Yora's magic boosting him. After a little while, they eventually catch up to Ornus, but to their surprise, he's just sitting on the edge of a cliff, watching something below. Alk looks down and sees a guy being chased by the floor boss, and he is begging Ornus to save him, but Ornus doesn't seem particularly interested in helping. Alk asks what's going on here, so Ornus explains that that guy is just really annoying. His name is Loki, and he is the support mage for the party that came here to rescue, but while most of the members of Rakroma are decent people, Loki has a shitty personality, so no one likes him. Loki yells at Ornus and tells him that if he dies here, he will make sure to haunt Ornus' dreams for the rest of his life, but Ornus seems like he'd be fine with that. All of a sudden, Loki trips and falls to the ground, so Alk says they should help since the monster is about to eat him. However, the others tell him that Loki isn't actually in any real danger since this is just how he usually fights. Just then, the monster steps on a magic circle embedded in the ground, and Loki gets a huge grin across his face. In the next moment, a pillar of fire shoots through the monster's abdomen, and Alk realizes that Loki must have set traps for the monster to fall into. The others confirm this, and as much as they don't like the guy, they can't deny the fact that he is a brilliant strategist on the battlefield. The monster continues stepping on more and more of Loki's traps, and Loki begins laughing at it for being so gullible, but he ends up running out of traps before the monster dies, so he is completely defenseless, and the monster is about to blast him to smithereens. However, just before Loki could be hit, Alk and the others finally step in to save his ass, so Ornus drags him to safety while the rest stall the monster. The monster tries striking at Alk, Yora creates a shield to protect him, and immediately after that, the monster turns and starts heading straight for Ornus and Loki. It is specifically after Loki since it wants revenge for all the traps Loki set up, and Ornus isn't going to be able to outrun it on this terrain, so he turns around and runs underneath the monster before chucking Loki over to Krejza, so she can handle him instead. Yora asks Krejza to take Loki to the high ground so he will be safe, and in the meantime, now that Ornus doesn't have his hands full anymore, he is free to fight at full strength. He asks Yora to give him all the support magic she can manage, so she goes all out and casts every enhancement spell she knows. Ornus charges straight for the monster, and after dodging its initial strike, he jumps into the air and stabs it just below the eye. Unfortunately, that didn't do enough damage to stun it, so Ornus gets knocked off and is sent crashing to the ground. Yora runs over to check on him, and just as the monster is about to stomp on Ornus, she puts up a shield to protect him. However, her shield won't be able to hold out much longer under this weight, so she asks Alk to hurry up with his spell. From the cliff top, Loki looks down at the battle, and before, he was too scared to notice, but now that he is paying attention, he's surprised to see that Alk is actually back. Loki has heard a ton of great rumors about him, so he is excited to see what the legendary genius can do, and just as he says this, Alk begins forming several magic circles simultaneously. Loki is amazed since casting 3 to 5 spells at once already puts you in genius territory, but Alk over here just created 20 without breaking a sweat. The monster realizes Alk is charging up a finishing move, so it charges at him in an attempt to stop it, but Ornis doesn't let that happen. And once Alk is done, he unleashes a relentless torrent of Thunderbolt spells to weaken the monster before finishing it off with a concentrated blast. But unfortunately, the monster managed to jump out of the way in time to avoid the final blast, so Alk warns everyone to brace themselves for its counterattack. Ornis calls out to Krazia and asks her to provide cover fire, so she aims her bow at the monster and hits it with arrow rain to slow it down. This buys enough time for Yorha to use binding magic to hold the monster in place, and Ornis takes advantage of the opportunity to launch his spear right through its head. The monster somehow managed to survive, so it tries launching one final attack at Alk, but that was the mistake it could have made because Alk has the perfect spell for a situation like this. His master taught him this spell years ago, and since then, Alk has been the only mage capable of pulling it off. Reflection magic. The monster's blast is redirected at full force, creating a massive explosion, and after it has been burnt to a crisp, Ornis jumps in to deliver the final blow, splitting the monster's head in two. Once the battle is over, Loki walks over to congratulate everyone on a job well done. He was especially impressed by Alk's performance, and he says he has heard a lot about Alk, the court magician's impressive feats, like how he once defeated a Hydra with a single spell. Alk is thankful for the praise, but he informs Loki that he isn't actually a court mage anymore. Loki is shocked to hear that since the people in charge of the royal court would have to be idiots to fire someone as talented as Alk. He is grateful that Alk and the others came to his rescue, but right now, the rest of his team are probably still busy fighting the tougher floor boss. Everyone is shocked to hear that there's a second floor boss, so Loki explains that there was more than one floor boss when his party got here. They couldn't handle both at the same time, so Loki's job was to get the attention of the one with the low IQ and lead it away so the rest of his team could handle the other boss. It was a knight in black armor, but since this floor is full of undead, it might just be a set of possessed armor. If that's the case, the physical attacks won't do much damage to it, so their best shot at taking it down will be Alk's magic. Loki hands Alk a cross artifact to use since he could tell that Alk knows how to handle himself in close combat since he often makes himself seem like both the biggest threat and the easiest target to eliminate to trick the enemy. Alk is surprised that Loki could determine all that just from watching him fight for a few minutes, but as a strategist, it's Loki's job to be perceptive. He tells Alk that the artifact in his hand is called Schwart, and he says Alk can have it for free on one condition. Krazia and Ornis don't like the sound of that since Loki wouldn't give out something so valuable without a major catch. Loki says it's nothing too serious, he just wants Alk to use zero magic when he goes up against the second boss. The others tell Loki it's crazy to expect a mage to fight without magic, but Loki tells them he has this all planned out. He explains that trickery and deception are his bread and butter, and since that Death Knight is probably expecting them to attack with magic, doing the opposite is sure to catch it off guard. Anyway, remember the prince who fired Alk. This is him now. He and the others are currently being chased through a dungeon by two caterpillar monsters, and the prince doesn't understand how this could have happened since he has never had trouble with these kinds of monsters before. He orders Lainey to use magic to take them out immediately, and she tries to do so, but for some reason her magic isn't working right now. The prince calls her useless and decides that he will just have to cut the monsters down on his own, but as he turns around and tries to slash one, his blade bounces off, and it was at this moment that he realized he might be washed. Lainey and the knight grab the prince off the floor after he got bodied and start running towards the exit. All the while, the prince tries to figure out what could have gone wrong. His swings used to be so much more powerful, and now that he thinks about it, he realizes that his drop in strength happened right around the time that he kicked Alk out of the team. However, instead of accepting that Alk was actually contributing to the team, the prince comes to the conclusion that Alk must have placed a curse on him to get revenge. After escaping the dungeon, the prince goes to see one of the royal magicians, Vogan Fornus, to check if there has been a curse placed on him, and after a brief magical scan, Vogan tells him there's no curse. The prince can't believe it because there's no way he would have struggled with clearing the 30th floor if Alk hadn't cursed him. But Vogan knows there's an anti-magic field down on the 30th floor, so he tells the prince that he probably just felt weaker because his support magic wasn't working. The prince scoffs and says all support magic is useless trash that cowards like Alk rely on, and Vogan is doing his best to stay composed in the face of the utter nonsense that the prince is spewing. However, he does find it strange that Alk didn't warn the prince about the anti-magic field down there ahead of time, since he is the legendary student who made it all the way down to the 68th floor. The prince laughs and tells Vogan that there's no way an idiot like Alk actually accomplished something like that, so it's probably just a rumor that the commoners spread amongst themselves. Vogan doesn't even bother trying to correct the prince since there's no cure for arrogant stupidity, but all of a sudden a guard enters the room to inform the prince that the king wants to speak to him regarding the situation with Alk. The prince smiles because he thinks his father will be on his side, but as soon as he arrives, the king begins telling him a story about Eldis. He explains that Eldis was a court magician whom he had banished years ago, and he was an incredible fool. Eldis was a noble who had the nerve to stand before him, the king of Galdana, and tell him that unless he changes the way commoners and court magicians are treated, a great tragedy will befall the nation in the near future. The prince speaks up and says Eldis deserved to be banished because no nobleman should speak the king in such a manner, but that wasn't the reason the king called him a fool. After Eldis was banished, he was stripped of his noble title and decided to attend the Magic Academy, silencing his critics with his exceptional skills and graduating valedictorian. However, even though he could have chosen to do anything with his fame and power, he foolishly chose to return to the castle and work as a court magician. During his time as a court magician, he continued to tell the king that the commoners are not worthless, and he needed to change the way he treats them until he ended up disappearing a year later. The king hadn't given Eldas' words much thought at the time, but lately he has started to wonder whether Eldas might have been right, which is why he ordered the prince to explore the dungeon. He wanted to see if nobles are truly inherently better than commoners, but considering the prince's condition, it looks like he was wrong. He says it might be time to change their policy of discrimination against commoners, so from now on he plans to hire those with talent, regardless of their background. The prince is stunned and tells his father that it would be a disgrace to their family name if they accepted commoners as equals, and the king acknowledges that he was the one who raised the prince to believe that, but things need to change. The prince tries to argue that consorting with commoners like Alk will only lead to misfortune, and he uses his current condition as proof of that. But all of a sudden, a guard comes over and presents Regulus with what's left of the book Alk wrote. The king explains that before he left, Alk created a comprehensive guide on how to clear the 30th floor of the dungeon for Regulus, but it was torn up by Laney before he ever got to see it. The prince can't believe what he's hearing, so he tells his father he doesn't feel well and excuses himself. As Regulus leaves, the king speaks to Vogan and tells him that while it may be difficult, he would appreciate it if he would help Regulus as much as possible, and Vogan promises to do his best. Meanwhile, Regulus is having a mental breakdown because if Alk really was knowledgeable and talented this entire time, then that means he was the problem all along and he can't accept that. Meanwhile, on Alk's end, he is currently asking Loki to explain why he doesn't want him to use magic against the boss. He understands that artifacts are powerful. The boss is meant to be immune to physical attacks, so he doesn't think he will be able to take it down with just the sword. However, Loki says he never expected Alk to defeat it with the sword. He just wants him to pretend to be a melee fighter so the boss won't expect him to use magic. The others understand the plan, but Krayja doesn't get why they need to go through the effort of tricking the monster, so Loki informs her that this boss is just as intelligent as they are. Alk finds that hard to believe, and Loki understands why he'd be skeptical, but all he is asking is for Alk to stick to using his sword, at least until Loki gives the signal. He agrees to go along with Loki's plan, and on that note, Loki tells Krayja there's something he needs her help with. It would take too long to get to his friends on foot, so he wants to use teleportation magic, but he doesn't have enough mana to cast it on his own right now, so he needs Krayja's help. The others all freak out at the mention of teleportation magic, since it is meant to be a well-guarded national secret, and simply knowing about it could get them in trouble, but there's no other choice here, so they decide to just pin all the blame on Loki if something goes wrong. While Loki is drawing the circle and showing Krayja how the teleportation works, Alk talks to Yora and asks her if Loki is someone he can trust. Yora tells him that personally she doesn't like Loki's personality, but in a serious situation, you can absolutely rely on him to get the job done. For example, she informs Alk that 2 years ago, Loki coordinated a large-scale raid on a high-difficulty dungeon, and thanks to his planning, the mission succeeded without a single casualty. Since that's the case, Alk decides to put full faith in Loki's plan, and once the teleportation circle is ready, they all step inside. Yora is amazed because this is her first time seeing real teleportation magic in action, but he tells her this is just a simplified version that will send them to a location of his choosing. On that note, he warns everyone that he will be teleporting them right in front of the boss, so they should be ready to fight as soon as they land. Loki then activates the teleportation circle, and in an instant they all vanish from the spot and land right in front of the other members of Loki's party fighting against the Dark Knight. The two have been doing their best to hold it off until now, but they haven't been able to do much damage and they are running out of stamina, but fortunately, Ornest jumps in to give them a chance to retreat. He clashes with the knight, and while the knight was focusing on Ornest, Alk attempts to sneak up on it from behind for a sneak attack, but it reacts instantly and jumps into the air to evade the strike. It then charges at both of them, and in the meantime, Loki and Krayja come up to help get Raywell and Marbel to safety. The armor of the knight is insanely tough, and from the looks of it, there's no one inside, but that makes no difference to Ornest. He runs forward to strike at the knight, and the knight attempts to jump over him, but Ornest had already planned for that, so he pins its cape to the ground, giving Alk the perfect opportunity to slice the knight's head off. As the metal helmet crashes to the ground, Alk wonders if that was really enough to defeat the monster, but things are never that easy in situations like this. The knight suddenly begins to move again with dozens of freaky tendrils popping out of its neck, and it's clear that this must be an undead headless horseman, and they must mean that the monster they killed earlier was its steed. Alk got lost in thought for a second there, and by the time he regained focus, he found the Dullahan in the air above him preparing to strike. He raises his sword to defend himself, but he is barely able to block its strike. It is much stronger and faster than it was before, so Alk realizes it must have been holding back earlier, and that means the fight is going to get harder from here on out. But thankfully, he doesn't have to deal with it alone. While Alk was facing off against the knight, Yora was spamming buffs on Ornest, and once he's ready, he lunges forward and strikes the knight at full force, giving Alk a chance to knock it back. Alk can't believe how durable that thing's armor is, and if this sword weren't an artifact, it would have long since shattered to pieces from the force of the knight's blows. Not to mention the fact that since the knight is undead, no matter how many times they hit it, it will always regenerate and get back up. Speaking of which, the knight managed to pick its head back up and reattaches it to its body before letting out an ear-piercing scream that leaves everyone disoriented. It then targets Alk and kicks him as hard as it can, sending Alk flying backwards with intense speed, but fortunately, before he hit the wall, Yora managed to use a barrier to cushion the blow for him. She runs over to check if Alk is okay, and he tells her he's fine, he just wasn't expecting the knight to be able to use martial arts so well. If Yora hadn't saved him with that barrier, then there's a good chance he might have died just now, so he asks Loki how much longer he needs to keep fighting with the sword. Loki is still in the middle of his preparations, so he tells Alk that he's going to need to hold out for 5 more minutes. That's easy to say, but Alk almost died to that thing just now, and he only has 3 potions left. Ornus is barely holding his ground right now, so he yells for Alk to get back in the game, and the two do their best to keep the knight busy for the next few minutes. Eventually, Loki's 5 minutes of preparation are complete, so he activates a giant magic circle and begins laughing. Seeing this causes the knight to panic and charge straight for Loki, slashing him across the chest, but that's exactly what Loki wanted to happen. It is revealed that this was all just an illusion, and the giant magic circle was just a trick to lure the knight into a trap. Just then, ice begins to form beneath the knight's feet as the real Loki watches from the tower top. Ornus then steps on a teleportation trap Loki and Krasia set up, and he is sent right behind the knight, allowing him to knock it forward right before Marbel jumps down from the arch with an overhead swing. The knight manages to dodge out of the way, but that was also part of the plan because Loki had set up another ice trap to debuff its speed. The knight realizes that Loki is the one behind all of the traps, so it climbs up the tower to take him out. Loki pulls out a magic blade to hold it off, but Reuel is worried because Loki isn't strong enough to handle the knight on his own. He did make preparations by asking Yoran to cast his 7-fold strength enhancement on him, but his body isn't used to this kind of strain, so he's barely able to hold on. While Loki is keeping the knight busy, Yora casts a binding spell to trap it in place, but the knight still manages to land a hit on Loki, knocking him off the archway and sending him crashing to the ground. However, Loki shows no concern because everything has gone exactly how he thought it would, so on his way down, he tells Alk that the stage has been set, and it's time for him to finish the job. Alk begins casting a large array of magic circles all around the knight, and Loki is impressed because this is even more than what he used against the other boss. However, after all the fighting Alk has already done, his body is starting to give out under the stress required to maintain such complex magic. He does his best to stay strong and gets back to his feet so he can cast the Thunderbolt acceleration spell, but while it does do a lot of damage, the knight is still able to move, and it is starting to break free from the binding magic Yora used on it. She does her best to keep it under control, but at this rate, the knight is going to escape any minute, so she tells Alk to hurry up and finish it already. However, that's a lot easier said than done because Alk's body is on the verge of quitting on him. This is the second time today that he has had to use such a powerful spell, and the sudden drain of mana would have left anyone else in critical condition. Alk is no exception, but he has a lot to fight for now, so regardless of how much it hurts, he pushes through and completes the casting process for one of his ultimates. A lightning dragon is formed, and as soon as Alk releases it, it flies straight towards the knight, vaporizing it on contact and putting an end to the battle. Now that there's no more danger, Alk collapses to the floor from exhaustion, and he jokes to himself that having reliable teammates makes a huge difference when you're facing danger. Yora comes over and tells him it's more like they were relying on him this entire time since they couldn't have taken that thing down without him, and Ornus is just glad that Alk is back to his usual powerhouse self. On another note, he reminds Alk of the bet they made earlier, and Alk recalls that before the fight began, Ornus said that the first person to pass out would have to do a dare, and Alk technically passed out a moment ago, so he's on the hook. Though since it was after the fight was over, Ornus decides to be lenient with the dare and tells Alk that from now on, he's not allowed to keep secrets from them if something is bothering him. Whether it be Ornus, Yorha, or Krasia, he wants Alk to talk to at least one of them when he has a problem so they can help him out. Rywell comes over to thank Alk and the others for their help. Marbel also wants to thank him, but she's a lot more hands-on and gives him a kiss on the cheek, much to Yora's horror. Marbel asks Alk if he'd like to raid dungeons with her sometimes, but Yora interjects and asserts that Alk is their party's magician, so she can't have him. The Rec Roma party owes Alk a lot, so as the leader, Rewell offers to write a recommendation for him. Alk is a little confused by the mention of a recommendation, so everyone explains to him that in order to be promoted to S rank, you need to have a recommendation from an S rank party and the guildmaster's approval. It should be hard to get the guildmaster on board, so Raoul says Alk can leave the rest to him. After that, Alk collects the knight's magic stone, and with this, the Rec Roma rescue mission is officially a flawless success. After returning to the guild, the receptionist congratulates Alk on the successful mission and tells him that he has become a hot topic in the guild as of late. She asks him if he managed to get some rest to recover after his big fight, and Alk says he's in perfect shape, so she hands him his reward, and he is about to go on his merry way. However, Leviel stops him before he could leave and tells Alk that he has a visitor from the kingdom of Galdana. Alk is surprised to hear that since he no longer has any business with the kingdom, but he decides to go meet with this visitor and finds Vogan waiting for him. Of all the people Alk had to deal with at the castle, Vogan was actually a chill guy, so he bows and says it's nice to see him again. However, before any pleasantries, Vogan asks if Alk was trying to get Prince Regulus killed, not warning him that he's too weak to handle dungeons on his own. Alk calmly responds by asking Vogan if he thinks Regulus would have listened to a word he said even if he did warn him, and Vogan realizes that Alk has a point. Still, he hates the fact that he got stuck with this crappy job after Alk was fired because it's a complete waste of his valuable time. Alk asks if that means Vogan was assigned as the replacement magician for Regulus' party, but Vogan says he can hardly call himself a magician anymore because he's more of a glorified babysitter. After Alk left, Regulus tried to challenge the 30th floor of the dungeon on his own, and he was severely injured in the process. Vogan hoped to lecture Regulus and help him learn a lesson from his failure, but instead, Regulus refused to accept responsibility and demanded that Vogan escort him here so he could confront Alk. Alk asks if that means Regulus is in the city right now, and Vogan confirms it, saying he's down in the underground training arena as they speak. Alk wasn't expecting to have to deal with Regulus again, but he thinks this is a good opportunity to settle the score for good. So even though he would be within his rights to ignore Regulus' existence altogether, he decides to head down there and confront him in person. As he and Vogan walk down the stairs, Vogan says that the only thing the prince is going for him is that he refuses to compromise on his pride. But that personally, he can't understand why the nobles insist on establishing themselves as superior to commoners because it looks like a massive waste of time to him. Alk reminds Vogan that he is also noble, but he has never really cared about titles because all he wants is to live his life the way he chooses. Once they arrive in the arena, they find Regulus standing in the middle, and to Alk's surprise, the first thing he says is that the king plans to change the way things are run in the kingdom, and while he personally doesn't agree, out of respect for his father, he will concede on that front. This gives Alk hope that maybe Regulus might have come to his senses after all, but he goes on to state that he still can't stand the idea of having to listen to nonsense from commoners like Alk. Alk tells Regulus that if he had listened to his advice, then he would have been in a much better situation than he is now, but Regulus refused to hear it. And Alk can tell that he's not getting through to him, so he decides to stop wasting his time. Regulus has lived all 15 years of his life being told that he is superior to commoners in every way, so he can't wrap his head around the idea that he might be the problem here. In a desperate attempt to prove that everything he has been told isn't a lie, he takes out his weapons and challenges Alk to a duel, and he wants Vogan to act as a witness to the battle. Regulus charges at Alk, forcing him to defend himself with his wand, but he is caught off guard by the fact that Regulus is using daggers instead of his regular long sword. A few years ago, when Regulus was first picking out his weapon, Alk had advised him to go with daggers instead of a long sword since his body was still too small to handle the weight effectively, but Regulus immediately dismissed his concerns without a second thought, but he is now following that advice. However, simply switching weapons didn't magically make him a better fighter, so Alk sidestepped one of his attacks, leaving Regulus to faceplant into the ground. He could tell that Vogan had something to do with arranging all this, so he asks what he said to the prince, but all Vogan told Regulus was that if he wanted to refute Alk's strength, then he would need to prove his claim by defeating him in battle. At the end of the day, it was Regulus' choice to come here and challenge Alk, and Regulus deserves a little credit here, because he didn't even consider pulling any dirty tricks. He just came here for a fair one-on-one. His daggers are artifacts, so they pack a decent punch, and when Regulus clashes with Alk head-on, he is actually able to break through his shield. But that's all that he could manage. Regulus did a lot of training with these daggers in preparation for this fight, and they made him realize that Alk's support magic was the only reason he ever made it so far in the dungeon. After Alk was fired, he kept trying to clear the 30th floor of the dungeon over and over, but he would always end up badly hurt afterwards, and he couldn't understand why. However, he eventually decided to read the recovered pages of the report Alk wrote, and it infuriated him that everything Alk wrote turned out to be true. So if he had used it from the start, he wouldn't have failed so much. Just from reading it, he could tell how talented Alk was, and that made it even harder to accept how he had treated him. So Regulus tells Alk to activate his artifact and face him. Alk asks Regulus if he's sure he still wants to fight even though he is aware of the power difference between them. And Regulus refuses to back down, but before they clash, Alk has one question. He wants to know if it's true that the king really wants to change the way the royal court is run, and Regulus confirms it, adding that his father was apparently testing the strength of the peasants, which is why he sent Regulus and Alk into the dungeon. If it was all a test, that explains why the king always treated him so kindly, and this news is the best thing Alk has heard all day, because it means those 4 years he spent as a court magician weren't wasted after all. Now, as for Regulus, he tells him to prepare himself because he won't be holding back. He pulls out his artifact to charge at him, and Regulus is quaking in his boots because he knows he's about to get the shit kicked out of him. But he still stands ready and awaits Alk's arrival. However, at the moment of impact, Alk changed trajectory and struck the ground instead of Regulus. Regulus demands to know why Alk chose to spare him, and he reminds Alk of all the times he insulted, ignored, and made fun of him for no reason. He built his entire identity around the idea that he was superior simply because he is a noble. But if that isn't true, then what is he supposed to do with himself now? He came here thinking that dying at Alk's hands would be a good way to at least preserve his honor, but even Alk is looking at him with nothing but pity, and he has no idea what he's supposed to do now. Alk usually doesn't like laughing at the misery of others, but he finds it funny how things turned out. He came here ready to fight Regulus, and he was sure Regulus would be yelling curses at him, but ended up asking for life advice instead, and the absurdity of the situation made Alk realize how silly this all is, so he isn't mad anymore. After realizing that Alk isn't angry at him, Regulus apologizes and says he is sorry for how he treated him before, and Alk is genuinely surprised since he didn't think Regulus had it in him to man up and accept his mistake. He understands that Regulus only acted that way because that's how he was raised, and while it doesn't make it right, since he's willing to change, Alk decides to look past it and extends a hand to Regulus. Regulus reaches out to grab Alk's hand, but then he pulls back at the last second because he's still a little embarrassed about this whole thing and he wants to maintain some of his pride. He goes on to pull out the court magician cloak that belonged to Alk and apologizes for taking it from him that day. He says Alk can have it back if he wants, and he also has a letter from the king stating that there's an open seat waiting for him at the royal court should he ever decide to return. Alk asks if the king is trying to order him to return, but Vogan tells him that this is explicitly a request, and he is free to refuse if he wishes. In that case, Alk says he doesn't need the cloak or the letter because he's perfectly happy with his party, and he has no intention of ever leaving them again. Regulus accepts Alk's decision, but he still wants him to have the cloak since it rightfully belongs to him. He then tells Vogan it's time for them to go because he has nothing more to say to Alk, but as he is walking away, he has a faint smile on his face, and it seems like both Alk and Regulus have gained some closure from this encounter. The next morning, Alk meets up with his friends and asks them if they have any free time today. Yora, Krasia, and Ornis all say they are free, so they ask what he had in mind. Alk says he was hoping to have them show him around Faisal since he still isn't used to things here. But while they would usually all be happy to help him out, Ornis and Krasia recognize this as a golden opportunity to give Yorha some alone time with Alk, so they both make up fake excuses to get out of it and tell Alk he's going to have to go with just Yorha. Alk doesn't notice anything strange about the others suddenly backing out, and Yorha just laughs it off, but she knows those two just gave her an easy layup. However, she almost immediately fumbles it by asking Alk if he wants to reschedule the date, but he says he's fine with it just being the two of them. Yorha gets excited when she hears him say that, so she gets up and promises to show him everything there is to see in Faisal. Later that day, Alk and Yorha are walking through town, and she explains to him that since Faisal is an adventurous city, things like weapons, armor, and all kinds of other items are sold here regularly. But she also warns him to be careful about what he buys because shady merchants will often try to scam you with worthless junk. It's good advice, but Yorha says this while she's literally fallen for a merchant's scam, so Alk isn't sure she really understands what shady looks like. The merchant is literally trying to sell her a drug that supposedly lets you fight for several days without rest, and Yorha has completely fallen for his pitch. But just one look at its menacing aura tells Alk that the pill is bad news, so he grabs Yorha's hand and tells her to follow him. He thinks it will be best if they just let Ornis and Krasia do the shopping instead since Yorha tends to get distracted, and while she doesn't deny that she falls for scams from time to time, the last time she told Ornis and Krasia do the shopping, Ornis came back looking like Zorro and Krasia bought a giant teddy bear, so those two can't be trusted to go shopping either. In that case, Alk offers to handle the party's purchases from now on, and Yorha tells him that it would be a big help. After walking a little further, Alk spots a coffee shop, so he suggests that he and Yorha should take a break, and they both head inside to have some tea. While they are sitting down, Alk recalls how Ornis and Krasia really seemed to hate Loki, so he asks Yorha what that was all about. Yorha tells him it's a long story and explains that 2 years ago they ran into an A-rank party that was having trouble in a certain dungeon, so they stopped to help. Soon after, Loki and Ruel also showed up to help, so they all ended up working together to defeat the floor boss. However, during the fight, Ornis got hurt protecting one of the A-rank adventurers by taking a bolt of acid spit to the back. After the fight was over, Ornis tried to pretend that he was okay, but his legs gave out on the way home, so Loki and Ruel carried him back. So far, Loki had treated Ornis pretty well, but while Ornis was passed out, his spear kept hitting Loki in the head, so Loki eventually snapped and tossed it into the forest, never to be seen again. Yorha doesn't think Loki did it to be mean or anything. In fact, he probably didn't think it would be a big deal since the spear was in terrible shape already, but Ornis really loved that spear, so when he woke up and found out Loki had thrown it away, he was really pissed. Even then, Ornis probably wouldn't have forgiven Loki if he had just apologized since it was an honest mistake, but Loki genuinely couldn't understand why Ornis would care so much about a busted-up spear. From then on, Ornis and Loki have been at odds with one another, and Yorha honestly thinks it's silly that their feud started over a simple spear. Alk agrees with her, but that still doesn't explain the reason Krasia doesn't like Loki, so Yorha explains that Krasia doesn't actually have a reason for disliking Loki, she just doesn't like his vibe. A little while later, Alk and Yorha start walking through town again, and it reminds Alk of all the time they used to spend shopping together back in Galdana. They would pool their money together to buy potions, and at one point, Krasia tried to make her own, but her experiments always ended up failing. As they continue walking, Yorha suddenly spots an elven ribbon on display in one of the stalls, and she can't believe her eyes. These are incredibly rare items that raise the user's magic power, and she's been looking for one for ages, but it costs 50,000 gil to buy, and she doesn't have that kind of money right now. She's really disappointed since if she doesn't buy it now, someone else will probably get it by the end of the day, but since it seems really important to her, Alk decides to buy it. Yorha asks if he's sure he wants to spend that much money on her, but Alk says it's for the good of the party since Yorha's magic is a large cornerstone of their coordination. Besides, he's loaded from all the money he saved while working as a court magician, so he wanted to get her something nice. Yora smiles and tells Alk she will treasure his gift with all her heart, and Alk is glad to hear it. The two then spend the rest of the day having fun together all around the city, and they end things off by watching the sunset from the clock tower. Yora asks Alk what he thinks of Faisal, and he says he loves how free and alive everyone here is because it makes him feel like a real adventurer. After hearing that, Yora asks Alk if being part of her party is really something he wants to do. She invited him to join right after he was banished from the royal capital, so she feels like she took advantage of the fact that Alk had nowhere else to go to convince him to join. She tells Alk that if he wants to leave, she won't stop him, but he cuts her off and says that he did have a few things he wanted to do in Galdana before leaving, but that doesn't matter to him anymore. Right now, his goal is to become the strongest party in the world, just like Ornis suggested, and he wouldn't be able to do that without Yorha and the others by his side, so he has no intention of leaving the party. Yora is glad to hear him say that, and it's a pleasant change from his normal behavior since Alk is usually the kind of person to keep things to himself. Alk says he just wanted to let her know how he truly feels. And there's actually one more thing he needs to tell her. Yora begins blushing because she thinks Alk is going to confess to her, but as she is leaning in for what she expects to be a kiss, he laughs and says the reason he is being so open about what he's thinking is because he lost a bet with Ornis, so he isn't allowed to keep secrets anymore. Yora realizes that Alk is still completely oblivious to the fact that she likes him, and it makes her feel embarrassed, since she was really hoping he would make a move, so she turns away in frustration, and Alk has no idea what's bothering her so much. The next morning, Ornis goes to wake Alk up and finds him passed out in bed with a bunch of books next to him. He tries waking him up normally by calling his name, but when that doesn't work, he simply pulls the sheets away and yells at him to wake up. He tells Alk that an adventurer always gets up at the crack of dawn to be ready for the day, and Alk understands that, but he has no idea how Ornis can have so much energy this early in the morning. After Alk is done getting dressed, he and Ornis head out into the backyard to start training, and they are going at it pretty hard, so Yora tells them to tone it down a little before one of them gets hurt. However, Alk and Ornis completely ignore her and start fighting even harder, both eager to outdo the other. The battle eventually ends with Alk's sword shattering against Ornis, but even though Ornis won, he calls Alk a monster for being able to keep up with him so well despite being a mage. Anyway, he thinks it's time they take things up a notch, so he tells Alk to pull out his artifact so they can continue fighting, but Yorha gets in the way and tells them to stop because if they go any further, someone is really going to get hurt. Just then, Loki happens to show up, and since everyone is training as an S-rank adventurer, he smugly offers to give them some coaching. However, the group isn't interested whatsoever, so they all start walking away to get on with their business. But then Loki pulls out an S-rank ID card and asks them if they really want to treat him this way when he recommended their party for an S-rank promotion. As soon as he says that, Yora turns around and starts begging to see the card since she is really excited for the promotion, but Loki says he won't hand it over unless Ornis apologizes for all the times he treated him like a jerk. Ornis refuses to say it, but all of a sudden, Krista and Rewell show up and tell Loki to stop causing problems for Yora's party. They explain that they already gave a recommendation for lasting period to be promoted to S-rank, and the Guildmaster approved it, so they are just here to drop off their new S-rank ID cards. Everyone is really happy about the promotion, but then Krista walks up to Alk and tells him that she doesn't think this is enough to repay everything he has done for her party, so she tells him that if he is ever in trouble, he shouldn't hesitate to call her for help. Alk appreciates the offer, so he says he will keep it in mind, and in celebration of the fact that lasting period is now S-rank, Loki suggests they should all head out to grab some lunch, so they all head over to the tavern and have a hearty meal, at Loki's expense of course. Alk is still having a hard time believing that he is really part of an S-rank party, but Ornis sees the expression on his face and tells him he had better not be thinking he doesn't belong here. He tells him that this is just the start of their legend, so if he lets himself get hung up on dumb insecurities, Ornis is going to beat the crap out of him. Alk says he understands, so Yora proposes a toast in celebration of their promotion to S-rank, and they order a barrel of the tavern's most expensive alcohol, much to the chagrin of Loki's wallet. Late into the night, everyone has had their fill, so they get ready to head home, but Yorha has passed out since she overdid it with the alcohol. Krasia says Yora was just in a really good mood, partially because of the party's S-rank promotion, but also because Alk rejected the king's invitation to return to Galdana so he could stay here with them. Just then, Misha comes running over looking for Krasia, and she explains that the guild needs an extra healer, so they could really use her help right now. Krasia agrees to help and heads over to the guild infirmary to start healing people, and she is surprised by how many injured people there are here, so she asks Masha if there was a failed dungeon raid recently. However, Masha tells her that these injuries weren't caused by monsters, they were caused by people. Krasia is shocked since this is the first she's hearing of this, but apparently a group of criminals has been attacking adventurers lately, and they call themselves the Shadow Guild. Just then, the Guildmaster comes over to call Krasia for help since he has another injured adventurer on his hands. The girl is in really bad shape, but the infirmary was full, so Liviel had to bring her up to his room. Her name is Olivia, and she was all alone when she was attacked by the Shadow Guild, so her condition is critical, but as long as Krasia is here to treat her, Liviel is sure she will be okay. Krasia begins inspecting all of Olivia's wounds, but just as she's about to begin healing her, Olivia wakes up and grabs Krasia's hand. She demands to know where she is, so Krasia explains that she was brought to the guild for treatment after being attacked by the Shadow Guild. Krasia then asks if Olivia remembers any useful information about the Shadow Guild, and just then, Olivia begins raging because she remembers how she was betrayed. She swears to get payback for what he did to her, so she asks Krasia to heal her as soon as possible so she can go out and fight. But Krasia flatly refuses because if Olivia goes out and starts fighting right after being healed, it will just make her condition worse. She gets annoyed and starts trying to convince Krasia to heal her by using force, but just like Krasia warned, moving around so much in her current condition makes her pass out, so Krasia begins the healing process again. Olivia is from the Nameless Party, and she is one of the best swordswomen in Faisal, but that begs the question, who would be strong enough to do this kind of damage to her? By the next morning, Krasia is done healing Olivia, and she is so tired that she falls asleep at the bedside. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Alk was at the library reading up on the arcane dungeon when he was suddenly approached by a boy named Leorg. He says he is a member of the S-rank party Nameless, and he asks Alk if he would be willing to join him on a labyrinth raid. This was the end of episode 6. Subscribe to not miss the next part.